So I said that this event is special for us, particularly in Dublin City Libraries, because we are presenting the 28th annual Sir John T. Gilbert Commemorative Lecture. And tonight is the first time the lecture is included as part of the Dublin Festival of History programme, because we are keen to bring Gilbert and his library to as wide an audience as possible. And the suggestion for this came from the current custodian of Sir John T. Gilbert's library in Pearse Street, Tara Doyle. And as it happens, Tara was also one of the founders of this very festival some years ago. So I just want to say shout out to Tara and well done. Yeah, your legacy is still here. So who was Sir John T. Gilbert? Well, born in Jervis Street, Dublin in 1829, Gilbert was a writer, an historian, archivist, librarian, and an avid book collector. He had a great interest in historical source documents, and he worked to collect and preserve these. Now, Gilbert wrote many books, including the seminal 3-volume A History of the City of Dublin. And of course, he produced a multi-volume calendar of ancient records of Dublin, so important to anybody who's researching the history of the city. And after his death in 1898, Dublin Corporation paid the then substantial sum of £2,500 to acquire his personal library of books, manuscripts and newspapers for the city and, of course, for its citizens. Considered one of the finest historical libraries of the time, Gilbert's library is housed in the Dublin City Library and Archive on Pearse Street, and it does form the cornerstone of the Dublin and Irish collections there. We display some images on the screens there. And just to say, we're always delighted to see people using the collection, so you'll find out all the information about how to get access to it on the website. So this annual lecture series was begun in 1998 to mark the centenary of John T. Gilbert's death. And the aim of the lecture series is to celebrate the life and work of Gilbert and the history of Dublin. And each year we invite a lecturer to discuss an aspect of the city's history. So tonight our distinguished speaker is Dr. Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History at UCD. As you know, Diarmaid has published over a dozen history books, and his main research areas are the social, political and cultural history of 20th century Ireland. All of his books are available to borrow in Dublin City Libraries, and of course I'm sure Martin will be happy to sell you a couple of copies as well in the bookshop. So it's 100 years since Dubliner Seán O'Casey wrote The Plough and the Stars, the final part of his trilogy of plays about Dublin and the revolutionary years. And this evening, Professor Ferriter will delve into O'Casey's Dublin for us. And this is a memorial lecture, and as is tradition, we don't take questions at the end because, well, it's just a tradition we have. But I am delighted now to welcome Professor Diarmaid Ferriter. Thanks, Diarmaid.
Gurmagat, Brendan, August Accordia, Gurmagat Goleras, Ericht, a Rinishiv Vehanso, Anocht, is Fleishor August Honor Vordum. Shomer Shaw is Untache, Shomer Starul. I'm very grateful to the organisers of the Dublin Festival of History, because they are keeping that flame burning to ensure that history thrives in this city. And I'm speaking to honour the legacy of John T. Gilbert, who had a ferocious commitment to the preservation and the dissemination of historical records. He was very active in defending the importance of that, sometimes to the nth degree, which meant sometimes that those he was seeking to persuade could fall victim to his rather wrathful tongue. But it's a measure, I suppose, of the deep, deep commitment he had to the preservation of the records of this city, and it's fitting that we pay tribute to that. And also, of course, to all of those in our library services. And I want to pay tribute to the Dublin City Library Service and the city librarians for all that they do to bring these events together, but also to ensure that this is a city that can be proud of events like this and of festivals like this, and that there is a premium placed on the idea of the communication of history in all its different guises. So it's really wonderful to be a part of that. I want to talk tonight about the city that Seán O'Casey was born into and the city that he spent his younger years in before he became established as the playwright we remember him as. And that Dublin city really was a place of great creativity, of considerable contrasts, of conflicting loyalties. And when I was looking at some of the histories of Dublin that have been published to date, I was drawn towards the renowned historian David Dixon, who wrote a wonderful history of Dublin some years ago. And his chapter on the period 1880 to 1913 is titled, "Whose Dublin?" ? It's an indication, I think, of the contemporary contestations and the vibrancy that were apparent. And in many respects, Seán O'Casey was a product of the tensions and the opportunities that were available in Dublin City in the late 19th and the early 20th centuries. He became an intellectual and political juggler. And I think the four facets that were ascribed to him as a writer by the scholar of Irish drama, Robert Hogan, the lyric, the caustic, the playful, and the sombre, were really what characterized Dublin City in the broader sense. And I do think it's essential to get an idea of the influences on O'Casey, the cultural influences, the political influences, the literary influences that molded his artistic imagination. It's probably fair to say that words were his defense during a period of great upheaval, in a city that was torn apart sometimes by economic divisions, by political revolt, by religious divisions, by literary bitching. I was looking at the work of the novelist James Plunkett, whose father knew O'Casey, and he wrote about Dublin during that period in the late 19th and the early 20th century as one that was a city of pride and poverty, of hunger, of heroism, of poltroonery, and of an elusive and scattered kind of grandeur, which is a lovely lyrical description. The greatest gift that Seán O'Casey was probably given was education, but he was also heavily influenced by the privations of his era. Scholars have often wondered whether Seán O'Casey had feet of tenement clay. Trying to answer that question has led to some acrimonious exchanges. We can, of course, look to Seán O'Casey's own publications, including in 1949, Inish Fallin, Fare Thee Well. And he wrote about how some newspaper men had recorded Seán's experiences, that he was a gutter snipe that could jingle a few words together out of what he had seen and heard, that he was a slum dramatist. And O'Casey insisted he held on to those labels with pride. He would hold with courage, he wrote, and wisdom what these conditions had given him. Now, whether or not he was a slum dramatist, as I mentioned, has been disputed. But you could also ask the question whether it's necessary to live in a slum in order to write about tenement living. He certainly did endure very difficult times materially. Ronald Ayling, another one of the biographers of O'Casey, has suggested that this enabled him to write in representative terms about the suffering of some of his peers, as a writer of moral intelligence and social imagination. Now, another biographer, Christopher Murray, points out that O'Casey's own account of his life is not at all reliable. We do know he was the last of 5 surviving children that was born into a Protestant family in Dublin in 1880. And Protestantism in the city at that time was experiencing decline, and it was to continue. By 1911, just 13% of the inhabitants of Dublin City were Protestant. And yet there was a striking visibility for the Church of Ireland. There were 7 autonomous Protestant denominations in the city at that time. But there was quite a distance, of course, between the elite Protestants, the socially elite Protestants, and the working class Protestants. Many working class Protestants like Seán moved around different rented properties, as did their Catholic counterparts. And of course, his father died when Seán was just 6. His father had worked for the Irish Church Missions. He has been described by some in that position as a lower middle class clerk. There was a modest personal library in the house that Seán could avail of. It's said that he became a proficient reader, and indeed a prolific reader, by the age of 8. And that some of what he imbibed included the Bible and Shakespeare and Tennyson. But he also suffered, of course, from ulcerated corneas, which were painful and debilitating. That raises interesting questions, of course, about sanitary conditions in Dublin City at that time. It wasn't until 1906 that a drainage system that involved depositing sewage beyond the harbour came into being, long after it had come into being in London. In his 1943 play Red Roses for Me, which was set during the railway strike of 1911 in Dublin, O'Casey wrote about a city of gaunt houses, where men and women were burrowing in them in the pathetic search for a home. And the census returns that we have access to for 1901 and 1911, of course, amplify an awful lot of those conditions. The population of Dublin City and County by 1911 was 477,196 people. 1/3 of them, those households, were living in single-roomed accommodation. That amounted to about 20,000 families. A lot of the middle-class members, of course, had left the city to the poor. They'd moved to the townships and the suburbs, Rathmines, Drumcondra, for example. There were 2 workhouses in the city, the South Dublin Union and the North Dublin Union. And they were frequently populated by those who had been born in rural areas, a reminder of the migration to Dublin City. Alderman Thomas Kelly was very vocal about the need for improved housing, but also the inhabitants of those workhouses. He suggested it was a city of paupers and mendicants. And he was very vocal in relation to the temperance cause. There were far too many pubs in Dublin, insisted Thomas Kelly, with the result that there was far too much squandering of the labourers' wages on alcohol. He wanted to promote temperance because the sober man's sons, he suggested, would not be loafers and his daughters would not be worse. Life expectancy in the city in 1911 for men was just about 53.5 years. For women, it was just over 54 years. Typhoid, dysentery, tuberculosis were big killers. And we know that the infant mortality rates were alarming. In city areas, you're talking about 150 per 1,000 live births. In rural areas, the figure was 74. The baby of a labourer that was born in Dublin at that time was 17 times more likely to die within the first year than the baby of a professional. Now, it wasn't all gloom, and much progress had been made. Charles Cameron, who was the medical officer of health for Dublin City, had insisted on improved sanitary inspections. Progress had been made in relation to drainage and lighting and water supply and transport. Dublin had a very impressive tram service in the early 20th century. But Cameron wrote very powerfully too about the acute poverty, about the poor, he said, who were getting out of bed or substitutes for bed without knowing where they are to get their breakfast. According to the 1911 census, there were 53,000 men in the city. Indefinite and non-productive class was the description that was given to those 53,000 men. Many families were existing on a diet of dry bread and tea and herrings. Many families were trying to live on less than 10 shillings a week. An estimated 60,000 needed to be rehoused. There were 5,532 tenements in Dublin in 1913. More than 1,000 of them only had one water closet for every 20 or 40 inhabitants. Now, efforts were made to improve the housing situation. Some efforts by Dublin Corporation, by the Dublin Artisans Dwelling Committee, by the Ivy Trust, but they really were small-scale contributions. Ruth McManus, the historical geographer of Dublin, has suggested these efforts were only really chipping away at the margins. Part of the problem, of course, was that there was a very small rateable base within the city because of the drift outside the city into the townships. It made slum clearance schemes ruinously expensive. But it was also the case, of course, that there were members of Dublin Corporation who were doing very well out of the tenement situation because some of the members of the corporation owned those tenement buildings. Now, when O'Casey's father died at the age of 49, there was inevitably a decline in the welfare of the family. Some have suggested that the poverty that was endured was not as abject as some of those who surrounded him. We do know, however, that the O'Caseys lost 2 and perhaps 3 children. The great theatre director Alan Simpson, when reflecting on the early years of O'Casey, suggested that the slums both fascinated and repelled him. And he wondered if O'Casey had been truly a part of those slums, would he have survived at all? But he was also interested in the significant sphere of concepts that were relevant to O'Casey during that period, particularly as he moved different houses and moved into the workforce. The significance of the dockside area of Dublin, the East Wall, the move to Hawthorne Terrace when he was age 9, and then to Abercorn Road at the age of 17, where he was to remain for almost 20 years. From 1902 to 11, he was employed as a labourer with the Great Northern Railway Company. He had a hunger for books more than food. He was also attuned to Dublin snobberies and the British imperial hinterland, and that was very relevant to where he was living. It's estimated that in 1911 there were 80 cross-channel sailings between Dublin and England every week. Some of the residents of that area in the East Wall were Belfast-born unionists who were working on the Northern Railway. Now, that railway network, of course, was very impressive. But it was also hugely dependent on unskilled labour. The dockers, the craters. Many of them were earning just about 18 shillings per week. And this was the kind of work that was casual, that was broken, that was seasonal. Katrina Crowe points out that 24,000 men, or 1/4 of the adult males in the city, were dependent on such labour. And agitation in relation to their circumstances and their conditions of work could be very costly, as O'Casey was to discover. He joined the Irish Transport and General Workers Union in 1911, at a time when there was an estimated 18,000 male members of the Transport and General Workers Union. Women were also being unionised. The Irish Women's Workers Union. The Jacobs factory employed in the region of 3,000, mostly women. And Delia Larkin, the General Secretary of the Irish Women Workers Union, was a friend of O'Casey's. And she suggested that the women were weary of being white slaves, toiling to fill the pockets of unscrupulous employers. The actress and trade unionist Helena Maloney was also vocal about conditions. And she was quite disdainful of the conservative nationalism of that period. She started the periodical Ban na hÉireann with Maud Gonne. Suffragettes were also active in Dublin. The Irish Women's Franchise League had been established in 1908. They famously, in June 1912, broke the windows of government buildings with stones. What's interesting about this from O'Casey's perspective is that he later depicted women who were resourceful and resilient in the face of feckless and inadequate men. It's revealing that in Juno and the Paycock, it's Juno who has the humanity and the strong sense of purpose and the moral authority that stands above the men. It's in that play, too, in the Boyle household, that we see it's only the women who are working. And Juno wondered in asking the question, what can God do against the stupidity of men? But it wasn't a question, it was an exclamation. In many respects, O'Casey remained preoccupied with this labour question for both men and women. The labour agitation, of course, famously culminated in the great lockout in Dublin in 1913 that lasted for 5 months. Some 20,000 employees locked out of their places of employment. It affected about 100,000 people in the city, to give you an idea of the scale of it. O'Casey venerated Jim Larkin, the leader of the workers. O'Casey wrote that God had grown sorry for the work-worn people and sent another man into their midst whose name was Larkin. That was in stark contrast to what Larkin said a Catholic priest had asserted in relation to Larkin, that the Antichrist has come to town. O'Casey described Larkin as trumpet-tongued of resistance to wrong, discontented with leering poverty. Larkin was elected to Dublin Corporation in 1912 and then became president of the Irish Trade Union Congress. He also established during that period the Irish Worker newspaper. And he made sure that Liberty Hall was central to a new mission, what was really a workers' counter-culture, where there was dance and drama. And as James Plunkett pointed out, this was not just the cause of material sufficiency, this labour agitation. It was about access to the culture and the graces of living. And O'Casey later went on to assert that culture is the way we live. Seán O'Casey began writing for the Irish Worker in June 1912, partly to expose the cruel working practices in the Great Northern Railway of Ireland. He had been fired from his job. Over the course of the next 2 years, he wrote some 62 articles. These included song and poetry. The tone was often trenchant, vituperative, idealistic, militant. It was also about his close involvement subsequently in the Irish Citizen Army, his brief but intense involvement. A lot of these preoccupations have led to complications about how to label Seán O'Casey. The labour historian Desmond Greaves suggested that his first enthusiasm was religion, which seems exaggerated. David Dixon suggested that he was a radical socialist, not a revolutionary nationalist. He was wearing various hats. He was promoting various causes. But he was very interested in song. The great music historian and piper and collector Terry Moylan has compiled the songs of that era, the late 19th and the early 20th century. And he suggested that O'Casey was responsible for a larger selection than most would expect. That did not mean they were particularly good songs. They were overwordy. They were full of the bathos of the era. Dost hear the traitor tell Ireland, dear Ireland, in whisper low or joyous yell, of thee, dear Ireland, of thee, dear Ireland. This intense early interest in song, of course, foreshadowed its inclusion in his later plays. But the earlier material, of course, was deliberately mock heroic, to airs that were a mixture of the music hall and the folk tradition. But there was a softness that was evident in the later plays. Consider the Plough and the Stars, when Nora Clitheroe pleads with Jack Clitheroe to bring them back to a honeymoon state of mind. The violets were scenting the wood, Nora, displaying their charm to the bees. When I first said I loved only you, Nora, and you said you loved only me. The chestnut blooms gleamed through the glade, Nora. A robin sang loud from a tree. When I first said I loved only you, Nora, and you said you loved only me. O'Casey. You're far too kind. I remember seeing Leonard Cohen in concert when he took out the keyboard and did his best to a rapturous reception. And that's what he said. You're very kind. But you can see there the ear for the tender, for the softer. And that was a well-known song that had been written in the 1860s when you and I were young, Maggie. It was written by James Butler. The music was written by James Butler in the 1860s to a poem by the Canadian George Johnson. And it gives you an indication of what that generation were absorbing in terms of song. And John McCormack also went on to sing a version of that song. And John McCormack, of course, was training as a young singer in the Palestrina choir in Dublin around that time also. And there were other illustrations, I suppose, of that musical and cultural vibrancy. The Theatre Royal, dated back to 1821, it had a capacity of 3,800 people. The Gaiety Theatre, dated back to 1871. There had been a music hall in Abbey Street since the 1840s. What was interesting about these venues was that the ticket prices varied so much that there was wide access to these venues. The city took these things seriously. Musically, it was often looking to nostalgia. But there were also opportunities for amateur actors and amateur drama. O'Casey and his brother, for example, established the Townsend Dramatic Society, interested in the plays of Boucicault and Shakespeare. The Mechanics' Theatre that was reinvented as the Abbey Theatre in 1904 was where O'Casey took part in the Chaperon by Boucicault. And that Abbey Theatre, of course, became one of the self-described four symbols of the life of O'Casey. The three other symbols in Dublin were St. Barbara's Church in Upper Sheriff Street, O'Casey's own house, and of course Liberty Hall that I have mentioned. He also had a deep and abiding interest in the war pipes and revered their antiquity. He established the St. Lawrence O'Toole's Pipe Band in 1910. And he wrote to Lord Castletown at the time. He was a great champion of Irish language and culture. He told him that the people of our district are working class. There's little interest here among the working class in the Gaelic League, but that involvement in the pipe band might turn them the way of the Gael. That pipe band was also significant for O'Casey because the journal of the band was where some of his first stories were published. It gave him an opportunity again to try and hone his craft. Now that phrase, turning people the way of the Gael, was one that stuck with me. It was a time-consuming and abiding passion for many of that era. The Gaelic League, as we know, had been established in 1893. And there was a certain urgency around the famous phrase of Douglas Hyde, its first president, around the necessity for de-Anglicising Ireland. Consider where the language lay at that point, at the end of the 19th century. The number of speakers of Irish had been reduced to about 600,000 in a population on the island of 4.7 million. But there was an even more telling figure in 1891 in relation to the fall in the percentage of Irish that was spoken by those aged under 10. It had fallen to just 3.5% of that age group. But Gaelic League membership was very healthy in Dublin City. Nationwide, it's estimated there were about 100,000 members in the country at large, in 900 branches by 1905. In 1903, an estimated 40,000 attended the annual Gaelic League March to this very venue, the Mansion House. The original city branch of the Gaelic League remains the largest, with about 600 members. Crucially, it was also socially mixed, and there were great opportunities there in relation to that mix. The historian of the language question, Brian O'Concover, has suggested that the Gaelic League, of course, didn't save traditional Ireland. It didn't save the Gaeltacht, but it did mould a new form of identity. It set the cultural agenda, he suggested, for the early 20th century, not least because it was the smithy in which many of the Irish leaders forged their intellectual and cultural souls. Many of them felt too that they had to travel west in order to absorb the real Ireland, to go back to the true well of inspiration. But the language question was also one that was being hotly debated in city and urban areas. And Seán O'Casey was a very keen student of the language from 1906 when he joined the Drumcondra branch of the Gaelic League. And that's where we get the Gaelicisation too of his name to O'Cahasic. But he also lamented that the Gaelic League offers a hesitant and insecure hand to the general worker and the docker. O'Casey was also involved in the Irish Republican Brotherhood from 1908. This came at a particularly interesting time for younger activists within this secret oath-bound Republican movement. They were very impatient with their father's generation. They felt they spent too much time drinking and reminiscing about previous battles, that there needed to be an injection of vigour, that the IRB needed to be revitalised. IRB membership exposed O'Casey to interesting channels, particularly when it came to those who went on to play a very prominent part in the revolution, those who identified as devout separatists. But what precisely Fenianism in Dublin City and other places was during that period has been contested. It's difficult to define. It can't be divorced, of course, from the social and economic context of that era that had witnessed such industrial change, that had witnessed emigration and social and economic tensions. There were opportunities as a result of these changes, but also alienation. And the Fenian movement really was one consequence of all of those themes. Irish society, largely as a result of famine, of emigration, had become more oriented to England and North America. There were those who were struggling to find a place for themselves in the new dispensation. That's the way Vincent Comerford, one of the historians of the Fenians, has put it. But it was no fleeting sentiment. It becomes complicated for O'Casey about where to position himself within this movement. Can we believe the description of O'Casey in Desmond Ryan's Remembering Seán, published in 1934? Desmond Ryan was a nationalist historian, a veteran of 1916, someone who had been deeply troubled and traumatized by the divisions within the Republican movement in later years. He was also a past pupil of St. Enda's in Rathfarnham. And in that book, Remembering Seán in 1934, he depicted O'Casey as a devout Republican purist. He described O'Casey attending a lecture in Dublin, a dour and fiery figure, swathed in labourer's garb. He looks a Jacobin of Jacobins as his small, sharp and red-rimmed eyes stab all the beauty and sorrow of the world. He speaks at first fluently in Irish, then launches into a violent Republican oration in English, stark and forceful, biblical in diction, with gorgeous tints of rhetoric. Desmond Ryan liked to fill in the colour, but it's probably an exaggeration. It's true, of course, that O'Casey could pen righteous lines, righteous Republican lines. He described the Irish tricolour, for example. Its green and white and orange hue shall signal death to England's crew. But according to James Plunkett, he could also laugh at that later. In truth, I think it's fair to assert that O'Casey struggled to fully identify with the Irish Republican Brotherhood. He hated Bulmer Hobson, who had been sent from Belfast to Dublin to try and revitalise the Irish Republican Brotherhood there. Hobson and Dennis McCullough, another Ulsterman, could be quite ruthless in clearing out the old guard, including, if necessary, their fathers from the Irish Republican Brotherhood. But O'Casey had very little time for him. Hobson was at the centre of the Teeling Circle of the Irish Republican Brotherhood that O'Casey had joined. Hobson, of course, had also founded Fianna Éireann, the Republican Boy Scouts, with Constance Markievicz. And O'Casey certainly did not like Constance Markievicz. He described her during this period as a spluttering Catherine wheel of irresponsibility. A Catherine wheel is quite the instrument of torture. I hadn't seen that description for a long time. He didn't think it was appropriate, of course, that someone with her aristocratic background should be leading a Republican and indeed socialist campaign. And he wanted the socialist cause to be prioritised over other causes. Christopher Murray, the biographer of O'Casey, has suggested that he had little interest in the dead weight of heroes, that he had no patience with the founder of Sinn Féin, Arthur Griffith, because Griffith was so hostile to socialism. Griffith believed, of course, that socialism would split the nationalist movement. That theme that labour must wait was already bubbling under the surface and sometimes indeed rising above that surface. They were further illustration of the tensions of that era. Many young radicals, of course, were keen to displace or to co-opt the professional and commercial elites that dominated national society at that time. And their attempts to do that, of course, led to much infighting and antagonism. Because O'Casey had an involvement with a multitude of organisations, he was perhaps exposed to the weaknesses in many of them. Robert Lowry, who has written the entry on O'Casey for the Dictionary of Irish Biography, has pointed out that he quarrelled with the Irish Republican Brotherhood, partly over its secretiveness. He argued with the Gaelic League also, suggesting they did not devote enough time to the recruitment of Protestants. And he scolded both organisations for their subservience to the clergy as he perceived it. He wasn't always correct in his analysis. And as to the wider politics of this era, the dominant strain, of course, was still that of constitutional nationalism. But the longer Home Rule was deferred, the more fertile the ground became for radical endeavour, including, indeed, the Irish Republican Brotherhood. It's within those layers of activism, of politicisation, that according to the novelist Colm Tóibín, O'Casey was, like Synge and Beckett, a difficult figure, attracted to the shadows and the margins, unable to join any group for long. That's another version of the assessment that has been offered by Desmond Ryan. He argues that O'Casey's mind could only hold one enthusiasm at a time. I think that too is an exaggeration. But so too was O'Casey's rather mean-spirited retrospective dismissal of the breadth of interests of his contemporaries who went on to fight in 1916. O'Casey insisted few of them cared a thraneen about art, literature, or science. But in truth, there was a lot more going on than that. Consider Roy Foster's book, Vivid Faces, for example. He documents a geography of radical Dublin in the early 20th century. Pockets of preoccupation with secularism, with socialism, with suffrage, indeed with vegetarianism, with feminism, but also a determination to radicalise theatre and to radicalise publishing itself. Another historian, William Murphy, has pointed to Dublin City and its wider environs in 1912, places that were in the throes of change, cities that were witnessing streets, meeting houses, workplaces, newspaper offices, homes, theatres, and individuals who were animated with the energy of sometimes contending and sometimes complementary social, cultural, and political movements. O'Casey's preferences, his activism, his involvement in disputes, his capacity when it came to words, of course expanded the range of characters that he later wrote about, that he could absorb, that he could dramatise. Consider the Dublin trilogy: The Shadow of the Gunman, Juno and the Paycock, The Plough and the Stars. Within that trilogy, James Plunkett found a bevy of narrow-minded craw-thumpers, of mendacious and self-seeking middle-of-the-road men, a galaxy of underprivileged joxers and fleuthers and Brennans of the Moor, who were not entirely incapable of lapses into nobility, and who used a sort of boastful fantasy as a defence against the unremitting insults of a contemptuous society. And there were also, of course, women of heroism and fortitude and instinctive compassion. Now, what frustrated O'Casey was the failure to realise his ideal of a Gaelic brand of socialism. He had insisted we will have a brotherhood of equality in a free Ireland, a bright and living Gaelic equality of opportunity. That's a very good summary of O'Casey's mission in early 20th century Dublin. But it was also a tall order, especially given the outbreak of the First World War, the turmoil within the labour movement, the emergence of the Ulster Volunteer Force and subsequently the Irish Volunteer Force, the intensity of the Irish Citizen Army. And O'Casey, of course, contributed to the drafting of the constitution of that Irish Citizen Army. And aspects of that constitution also found their way ultimately into the 1916 proclamation. O'Casey had very strong views on these developments in Dublin City and beyond. But there was what has been described as the dark curtain of eternal separation that the 1916 Rising drew between him and some of his peers. And yet he was able to transmute these difficulties, this inner conflict, this torment really, into art. 100 years ago, in his small room in the North Circular Road, O'Casey had pinned a note above his desk. Get on with the bloody play. That play became the Plough and the Stars. The same year that he wrote Get on with the bloody play, he wrote a letter to a contemporary in which he suggested, it isn't a question of English or Irish culture with the inanimate patsies of the Tenements, but a question of life for the few and death for the many. But within those tenements, of course, he also found resilience and humour and a marvellous use of language. But that use of language was causing consternation. Exactly 100 years ago, in September 1925, one of the Abbey players, an actress, wrote to Lady Gregory about the script that was causing such grief. At any time, she said, I would think twice before having anything to do with it. The language is, to use an Abbey phrase, beyond the beyonds. The same year that The Plough and the Stars was staged was the same year that O'Casey left Dublin City, 1926. There was a row, of course, behind the scenes about what was an acceptable level of censorship. Lady Gregory had insisted, in reacting to George O'Brien, the government's representative on the Abbey board, that if it was a choice between artistic freedom and the state subsidy, well, then artistic freedom would win out every time. There were, of course, some changes made, but not so many that diluted the essence of going beyond the beyonds, as was put at the time. We can be very grateful, I think, in looking back at O'Casey and his Dublin, that he did indeed get on with the bloody play and that he went beyond the beyonds. Gurmila Magwith.